The 30th of April, 1945, Nazi Germany. The Soviet forces liberated Ravensbrück, one of the worst Nazi concentration camps, which would epitomize the true bestiality and horrors of the Nazi regime and its death camps. Upon entering the camp, the soldiers from the Second Belarusian Front encountered thousands of emaciated and sickly women still imprisoned in the camp, who endured forced labor, malnutrition, medical experiments, and extreme abuse. Following the liberation, the Soviet soldiers provide medical aid and care to the surviving inmates and attempt to identify the remaining SS guards and personnel responsible for the atrocities committed at the camp. In the years that follow, many of the former Ravensbrück camp staff will face trials for war crimes and crimes against humanity that they committed during the Second World War. One of them is Fritz Suhren. Fritz Suhren was born on the 10th of June, 1908, in Varel, then part of the German Empire. On the 1st of October 1928, he joined the SA, and 2 months later Suhren became a member of the Nazi Party. In October 1931, he joined the SS. After Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, the Nazi Party rapidly consolidated its control and implemented its ideology. Hitler and the Nazis worked to dismantle democratic institutions, suspended civil liberties, curtailed freedom of the press, and quickly implemented a series of discriminatory policies, primarily targeting Jews. The Nazis ruthlessly suppressed any form of dissent or opposition. Political opponents, including communists, socialists, and members of other parties, were arrested, imprisoned, or sent to concentration camps. In March 1939, 1 year after the German annexation of Austria, Fritz Suhren was sent to Graz to work as an SS section staff leader. Whilst there, Suhren became an alcoholic and had to commit not to drink any alcoholic drinks for 2 years. World War II started on the 1st of September 1939, and 2 years later in 1941, Suhren was sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp to work as a deputy commandant. The camp was located north of Berlin and held Jews, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma and Sinti people, and later Soviet civilians. One of the camp's most prominent prisoners was Igor Dzugashvili, Joseph Stalin's son, who died at Sachsenhausen in 1943 after his father refused to make a deal to secure his release. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Nazi Germany under the codename Operation Barbarossa invaded the Soviet Union, its ally in the war against Poland. 3 army groups, counting more than 3 million German soldiers, attacked the Soviet Union across a broad front stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The soldiers were supported by an additional 650,000 troops from Germany's allies. In the first 6 weeks after the German attack, the Soviet Union saw catastrophic military losses, and the German armies eventually captured some 5.7 million Soviet Red Army troops during the Second World War. From the very beginning, German policy on the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was determined by Nazi ideology. German political and military leaders regarded Soviet prisoners of war not only as racially less valuable, but as potential enemies, obstacles in the German conquest of living space. The Nazi regime claimed that it was under no obligation for the humane care of prisoners of war from the Red Army because the Soviet Union had not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, nor had it specifically declared its commitment to the 1907 Hague Convention on the Rules of War. Many Soviet prisoners of war died due to the appalling treatment, malnutrition, diseases, and executions. Some 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war, or about 57% of those taken prisoner, were dead by the end of the war. Second only to the Jews, Soviet prisoners of war were the largest group of victims of Nazi racial policy. A few weeks after the German attack on the Soviet Union, several high-ranking SS officers met in Sachsenhausen concentration camp to discuss the fate of these Soviet prisoners. The first group of Soviet prisoners of war arrived in Sachsenhausen at the end of August 1941. By the end of October of the same year, the SS had deported about 12,000 Soviet prisoners of war to Sachsenhausen. Camp authorities shot thousands of them shortly after they arrived in the camp. Estimates of Soviet prisoners of war killed at Sachsenhausen range from 11 to 18,000. According to the witness and capo, Karl Zander, Fritz Suhren oversaw the mass execution. In the early stage of the camp's existence, the SS and police incarcerated mainly political opponents, and one of them was Harry Neuox, a German anti-fascist and communist. Because of his unflappable calm and his organizational talent, he was chosen by SS authorities to serve as a camp elder and oversee the other inmates. This difficult and dangerous post often changed hands, as different groups of prisoners schemed to obtain it for themselves. Noyox was generally regarded, at least among other prisoners, as having acted with integrity and courage. In May 1942, he was ordered by Fritz Suhren to execute a fellow prisoner by hanging, but he refused. Noyox was able to survive the insubordination and to avoid executing the prisoner himself, but he was forced by Suhren to stand next to the gallows during the hanging, which was made to be particularly slow and painful. In September 1942, Fritz Suhren came to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where he would serve as a commandant. His policy upon taking command in 1942 was to exterminate the prisoners through working them as hard as possible, while feeding them the least amount of food he could. Ravensbrück, opened in May 1939, was the only major women's camp established by the Nazis. In total, some 132,000 women from all over Europe passed through the camp, including Poles, Russians, Jews, Gypsies, and others. Of that number, over 92,000 women perished. Ravensbrück camp was staffed both by SS men, who served as guards and administrators, and by 150 women who served as supervisors. These female supervisors were either SS volunteers or women who had taken the job for the good pay and working conditions. Ravensbrück also housed a training camp for female SS guards, who were taught by Dorothea Binz, the sadistically cruel German Nazi officer and supervisor, who instructed her trainees on how to handle the prisoners that they were going to supervise. These prisoners would have to work until they died, and the task of their supervisors was to get the maximum amount of work out of them whilst they were still alive. Ravensbrück thus also became a training center, or a school of violence, for about 3,500 female guards who went on to serve either there or at other concentration camps. Starting in the summer of 1942, SS medical doctors subjected prisoners at Ravensbrück to unethical medical experiments. The main coordinator of these experiments was Karl Gebhardt, and his assistants became doctors Hertha Oberhäuser and Fritz Fischer. They often used a hammer to break legs of female prisoners, then infected open wounds with aggressive bacteria, and monitored the healing with and without various chemical substances such as sulfonamide, which was an early antibiotic to prevent infections. Believing it could help in treating amputee soldiers, they also tested various methods of setting and transplanting bones. Such experiments included amputations and were often performed without any anesthesia. The SS selected nearly 80 women, mostly Polish, for these experiments. Many of the women died as a result, and those who survived often suffered permanent physical damage. SS doctors also carried out sterilization experiments on women and children, many of them Roma people, to develop an efficient method of sterilization. They were also involved in forced abortions of women who were already 7 or 8 months pregnant. In addition to these forced abortions, they were also known for the beating of pregnant women to cause miscarriages and the killing of newborns. As Commandant of Ravensbrück, Suhren had to provide inmates to Dr. Karl Gebhardt for experimentation. Suhren initially objected to this, mainly because most of the inmates at the camp were political prisoners, and at the beginning of 1943, he went to Berlin and complained to the Reich Security Main Office about the practice. However, the SS command overruled Suhren's doubts, and he was forced to apologize to Gebhardt and supply him with the prisoners he demanded. Suhren later said he witnessed experiments that included exposing women to high levels of X-rays in order to accomplish sterilization. One of the inmates at Ravensbrück concentration camp was Odette Sansom, an Allied secret agent who worked with the French resistance and in 1943 was arrested by the Gestapo. While working for the French resistance, Odette Sansom developed a close relationship with Peter Churchill, a British Special Operations executive who was not related to the British Prime Minister at the time. When they were both arrested by the Nazis, Churchill and Sansom claimed that they were a married couple and related to Winston Churchill to make themselves seem more valuable as prisoners and less likely to be executed as spies. On the 3rd of May 1945, with the Allies just a few miles from the camp, Suhren decided to drive Odette Sansom to the United States base because he believed that she was a relative of Winston Churchill and hoped that her presence would save him. When they reached the base, he stepped out of the car and announced to the Americans, "This is Frau Churchill. She has been a prisoner. She is related to Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England." Odette said in response, "And this is Fritz Suhren, Commandant of Ravensbrück concentration camp. Please make him your prisoner." When Suhren was arrested, he possessed valuables stolen from the prisoners, such as currency, gold teeth, rings, and watches. When the Red Army liberated Ravensbrück on the 30th of April, 1945, there were about 3,500 sick women, men, and children in the camp. Of some 132,000 women who passed through the camp, over 92,000 women perished. After the war, justice finally caught up with the former staff of Ravensbrück when they were tried at the first Ravensbrück trial, which began on the 5th of December, 1946. On the 3rd of February 1947, the British military tribunal sentenced 11 defendants out of the 16 to death by hanging. But Fritz Suhren was not among them, as in 1946 he had escaped and fled to Bavaria. However, he did not escape justice. In 1949, Suhren was recaptured by the US soldiers, who extradited him to the French occupation zone, which was one of the 4 Allied occupied areas in Germany after World War II. Suhren was then put on a trial which began in February 1950. Several dozen former prisoners testified against him, and on the 10th of March 1950, a French military court found Suhren guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced him to death by firing squad. Suhren was 42 years old when he was executed on the 12th of July, 1950. There were no tears shed for Fritz Suhren. Thanks for watching the World History Channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss our next episodes. We thank you, and we'll see you next time on the channel.